Hello and a very warm welcome to the FIA headquarters here in the Place de la Concorde in Paris. The Testgate Tribunal hearing is over, but we're yet to reach a verdict, and that despite 7 hours of submissions today, so plenty for Kevin Easton of The Times and Ted Kravitz of Sky Sports F1 HD to mull over. We began at 8:30 this morning. Amongst the first to arrive, the co-defendants, as it were, Ross Brawn of Mercedes and Paul Hembry, Pirelli's motorsport director. They were followed in by Christian Horner, one of the two accusers, although Ferrari's Stefano Domenicali stayed away. Christian, why is it important you're here today?
It's important that there's a fair hearing, so just, I'm sure every instance there will be.
Is that a clear case?
We'll see.
They went in front of a 5-man judging panel headed by Edwin Glasgow QC, and Ross Brawn himself at one stage took to the stand to face cross-examination. At the end of it all, the three principals, Horner, Hembry and Brawn, came out to face the cameras.
I'm pleased to be able to demonstrate that Mercedes were able to demonstrate that we acted in good faith and that we gained no sporting advantage. I'd like to thank the Tribunal and its President for a very fair hearing, and we're expecting a result tomorrow.
Paul, you said you'd hope to escape sanction before you arrived here. Are you as hopeful now?
Sorry.
It was a good hearing. We've always acted in good faith, and we'll have the result tomorrow. That's all we have to say at this moment in time.
Christian, very quickly, if I could ask, were you convinced by Mercedes' arguments today?
Not really, but it's down to the tribunal now, so they've got all the facts. So we trusted them to make an appropriate decision.
They said a reprimand might be enough. It was a minor infringement. I mean, would you want a sporting penalty?
I think it's down to the tribunal to decide. It's not for us to comment on what the penalty should be, but usually if you commit a sporting offence, there's a sporting penalty that goes with it. What
about this notion that it was a Pirelli test rather than a Mercedes test?
I think it's quite clear that whenever you run a Formula 1 car, you're learning something, particularly a current car. So it's almost irrelevant of what tyres it had on.
Are the FIA in the dock over this? Did they mislead Mercedes in this case?
I think there's perhaps a degree of ambiguity, but the rules are very clear, and all the teams know what the rules are. They spend an awful lot of time and involvement in writing the rules with the FIA. So I think all the teams are quite clear on what the rules are.
What would you consider as a fair penalty?
That's down to the tribunal. I think the problem is if it's only financial, then that becomes the cost of going testing, and I think it needs to be, the most important thing to come out of this is clarity. Either you're allowed to test or you're not. I mean, obviously Ferrari have conducted a couple of tests that have come out of this as well, albeit in a 2011 car, which is within the regulations. But I think the most important thing moving forward is that there's transparency and clarity, because the way that test was conducted isn't right.
It was a long day. At the end of the day, who do you consider as guilty? FIA, Charlie's, Mercedes only, Pirelli maybe?
I think, look, we raised a protest against Mercedes because, in our opinion, they breached the sporting regulations. So that's it. I think there's been a fair hearing today. All the parties have represented their cases, and that's it.
So, Kevin, Ted, it was a marathon day in session today. Fascinating to see some of the inner workings of Formula One in an intrigue like this. But first of all, we heard that the case for the prosecution, as it were, the FIA outlining the case against Mercedes. What was the nub of that, effectively?
Well, it was surprisingly damning in some ways, I thought, Ted. I was quite surprised at the vehemence of the argument that using the 2013 car was illegal, yet Mercedes obviously thought that they had permission to do that. And that appears to be the nub of the argument, because we then discovered that Ferrari had also had two tests, one last year, one this year, in which they'd gone through almost the same procedures, the same sequences, apart from this one item which was using the current car. That was the nub of the argument, and I guess that's what the judges will have to decide tonight.
Yeah, the sporting regulations were contravened clearly, according to Mark Howard, who was prosecuting for the FIA, saying that any track running was effectively a test on Mercedes' part, and that Ross Brawn basically gave the game away by saying we did undertake track running.
Yeah, well, two things for me, Craig. First of all, that the FIA were very clear that any perceived permission that Mercedes would have had from the FIA's race director Charlie Whiting didn't count as permission, but then they got to bringing the sport into disrepute. The old Article 151, didn't they, of the sporting regulations?
C we love.
Exactly.
Yes, we love that one.
Well known. It's actually of the International Sporting Code of the F1 rules, and that was quite surprising actually. The ferocity of which the FIA went at Mercedes, saying that they had acted in a way prejudicial to the interests of competition. And it was then that, I don't know about you, Kevin, but I started to get very worried for Mercedes, because the FIA put quite a good case that by testing and by gaining advantage from testing, the Mercedes had actually got into a position where they gained an unfair advantage, an unfair racing, sporting advantage over the other teams. And we've seen that breaches of 151 in the past have carried the big penalties, the race bans, the removal from the sporting regulations. And I thought the FIA were quite strong on that. What did you think?
Well, I think the worrying aspect, as you say, is that we have precedent. We have the $100 million fine for McLaren. We had Honda thrown out for 3 races a few years ago in similar circumstances. And at worst, I think Mercedes are looking at a ban, disqualification from the Constructors' Championship. At best, a very, very heavy fine, which could be very embarrassing for one of the world's proudest car makers. So I think it's a bit of a tricky area, this one. But I don't know. By lunchtime, I was a bit depressed on behalf of Mercedes after hearing the FIA case. Post-lunch, I think they may have retrieved some of it, because there are so many grey areas. What struck me is that there are enough loopholes in this to drive 10 Formula One cars through. The rules seem very, very slack.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, one of the pillars we thought of Mercedes' defence was this email trail, which we thought existed, and it turned out it does exist, between Ross Brawn and Charlie Whiting at the FIA, who also liaised with Sebastian Barnard, who's the legal advisor within the FIA. Ross Brawn obviously seeking to see if it was okay to run a 2013 car. Very interesting, the FIA's stance on this, almost saying, well, they did obliquely say, Charlie Whiting can only give an opinion. He doesn't make the rules, and he is not the law. You can't go past the law. I mean, but is there a mixed message? Have Mercedes been misled in all of this?
Well, the trouble with Formula One is that everything is an ad hoc arrangement, isn't it? Commercial deals are done on handshakes, and the rules to some extent are done, on backroom conversations. And every team in Formula One goes to Charlie Whiting for advice, and what he says goes on almost every occasion. And then today, we discover he's not the authority at all. It turned out to be a fellow that nobody had heard of. They were looking around the room when Edwin Glasgow asked, well, who is the authority? You could see everybody sort of saying, well, that's a very, till a guy put his hand up, and oh, yes, it's him. A bit late by then, isn't it? Yeah. But when Ferrari held their 2 tests, all they did was ring up Charlie, and he said, yeah, go ahead. So what's different about Mercedes?
Yeah, so isn't that some mitigation for Mercedes, even if they are found guilty of breaking the rule?
It is, of course, but Mercedes lent very heavily on the fact that they shouldn't be found guilty of contravening the interests of competition, because Ferrari had done the same thing, and that Mercedes were acting in the interests of Formula One to try and solve this tyre safety issue. But I think by saying that if we're guilty, then Ferrari are guilty as well, is kind of barking up a bit of a dead end, if I can mix metaphors there, for Mercedes. I don't think they're going to get anywhere with that, because Ferrari, the simple fact is, did their test with a 2-year-old car, so they weren't even called into question. They're not up for judgment in this case. But if I can just read you those emails from Charlie Whiting to the FIA legal director, Sebastian Barnard, saying, in my view, the test would not be would be allowed if we can allow Pirelli to run the test. And then the response was, dear Charlie, yes, we could take this position as long as it's not from the competitors, not from Mercedes, as long as it's a Pirelli test. So that's why, Kevin, we kept hearing Ross Brawn's defence. He must have said it a million times. It was a Pirelli test. It was a Pirelli test.
That chimes in, by the way, with this arrangement Pirelli have to maybe test a car, well, a non-specified car, because of the commercial contract with the FIA.
Well, we're back to the loophole, aren't we? That nowhere does it say in the rules that it can't be a current car. So all of this is done by this sort of ad hoc agreement. So nobody really knows. And because it's always been done on a nod and a wink, suddenly this time the nod's not being good enough, and neither is the wink. And so Mercedes get to carry the can. And you just wonder quite why, going back to what you were saying, why the FIA has pursued this with such vehemence. And it really was, quite worrying this morning, I think, for Mercedes.
Yeah, because the context of this is particularly with regard to Pirelli. They have their Tyre contract, which they're looking to extend. Did language that we heard from the FIA today suggest to you that they are keen to extend their Tyre contract?
Well, Paul Hembry, the Pirelli Motorsport director, said a couple of days ago that they don't want to leave Formula One, but you just wonder whether the board members back in Italy are looking at this and thinking, you know, we've taken all the flack this year, we're getting the blame for rubbish racing, and now we're sitting in court. And they were quite, definite in their argument today that they are not bound by any of these regulations. The FIA equally adamant that they are. And you just wonder if the hammer comes down on Pirelli, whether they won't just say, oh, look, let's forget it, let's do something else.
And the other thing about Pirelli is, of course, that we learned that apparently it's in Pirelli's contract with the FIA that they have to abide by all FIA technical regulations and sporting regulations. That was the charge from the FIA. As Kevin says, the FIA said, no, it's not us. Not only do you not have any authority over us, but you don't have, we're not actually signatories to any of these as well. So that's something that needs to be cleared up.
Yeah. In final submissions, Paul Harris, Mercedes QC, it seemed to me, tried to sketch out what he thought might be the acceptable bounds of punishment if Mercedes were found to have broken that rule, that Article 22. On the one hand, on the light side, if you like, it would be a reprimand, but on the strong side, he seemed to suggest they'd be open to maybe missing a day or something like that of the young drivers test at Silverstone. How would that sit with the likes of Christian Horner and the other teams who are objecting to what Mercedes have done?
Well, I don't really want to put words in Christian Horner's mouth, but I think he'd rather see a points deduction or even a ban. I mean, Red Bull have taken a pretty hard line on this, and you've got to say that that could be for competitive reasons, if for no other. Again, I'm a bit worried that Mercedes, if they're hit hard, might react badly to this, but we'll have to see.
Okay, just to wrap up finally, are we going to see Lewis Hamilton line up at the British Grand Prix?
Best guess, yes. I certainly hope so. Otherwise, British fans are going to be very upset.
It's possible that if Mercedes are found guilty in the morning, that they could be given a race ban. That could be British Grand Prix, could be the German Grand Prix. There is precedent for that, as Kevin says, with Honda in the mid-2000s. I don't think it's likely, but it is possible. I think what's more likely, if they are found guilty, is a big fine and a Constructors' points deduction, maybe even thrown out of the Constructors' Championship.
Okay, thank you very much, Ted. Thank you very much, Kevin. That would certainly be a bombshell verdict if Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg are banned from the British Grand Prix. Make sure you tune into Sky Sport News to find out that verdict. We'll be live from Mercedes tomorrow.